The morning sun had barely risen over the rooftops when Jason Taylor's pager buzzed against his hip. 15 years as a firefighter had trained his body to respond before his mind fully woke. He swung his legs off the bed, careful not to disturb his wife, and was dressed in seconds. The station came alive as the call details came through. A possible structure fire in Pine Hills, one of the city's wealthiest neighborhoods. Jason and his crew moved with practiced efficiency, the routine so familiar it almost felt like a dance. Each person knew their role without needing to speak. "Let's move out," Captain Reynolds called, and within minutes, the engine's sirens cut through the quiet morning as they sped toward Pine Hills. Jason sat quietly in the back of the truck, mentally preparing himself as he always did. 15 years on the job, and the rush of adrenaline before arriving at a scene never changed. He checked his gear one more time, a habit that had served him well throughout his career. "Looks like we're first on scene," the driver announced as they pulled onto Maple Street, where wisps of smoke were already visible from a large colonial-style home at the end of the block. The engine had barely stopped when Jason and the others jumped out, grabbing equipment and assessing the situation. The smoke wasn't heavy yet, but Jason knew how quickly that could change. His training kicked in as he and his partner Luis began to unroll hoses and establish a perimeter. "Taylor, Rodriguez, secure the area and check for occupants," Captain Reynolds ordered. "Thomas and Chen will set up the waterline." Jason nodded, his face already sweating beneath his helmet. The neighborhood was starting to wake up, with a few curious residents peering from windows or stepping cautiously onto their porches. "Sir, you need to stay back," Jason called to an older man who had wandered too close to their operation area. The man nodded and retreated, a look of concern on his face. Luis tapped Jason's shoulder. "I'll take the east side. You cover the front and west." They separated, each focused on their tasks. Jason was working on setting up reflective markers to establish a safe zone when he heard the squeal of tires behind him. He didn't turn immediately, assuming it was additional firefighters or paramedics arriving. It wasn't until he heard the sharp voice that he realized something was wrong. "Freeze. Don't move." Jason slowly turned, his hand still holding the reflective marker. About 20 feet away stood a white police officer, his service weapon drawn and pointed directly at Jason. The officer's face was tight with suspicion, his stance aggressive. "I said don't move," the officer repeated, his voice rising. Jason remained completely still, his heart suddenly pounding in his chest. Despite the 15 years in his uniform, despite the fire truck clearly visible behind him, despite the emergency lights flashing all around them, he was looking down the barrel of a gun. "Officer, I'm with Oakland Fire Department," Jason said calmly, though his mouth had gone dry. "We're responding to a structure fire call." "Shut up and put your hands where I can see them," the officer demanded, taking a step closer. His name badge read Dawson. Jason slowly raised his hands, the reflective marker still clutched in his right. He was acutely aware of his blackness in that moment, more than he had been in a long time. His uniform, which usually gave him a sense of protection and purpose, suddenly felt like it meant nothing. "I'm going to need to see some ID," Officer Dawson said, his gun still aimed at Jason's chest. "My ID is in my jacket pocket," Jason replied evenly. "I'm going to reach for it very slowly." "No sudden movements," Dawson warned. Jason carefully moved his hand toward his pocket, his eyes never leaving the officer's face. He could see Luis in his peripheral vision, frozen in shock at what was unfolding. "Hey, what's going on here?" Captain Reynolds' voice boomed across the yard as he noticed the confrontation. "Stay back," Dawson shouted, briefly shifting his attention to the approaching captain, but keeping his weapon trained on Jason. Captain Reynolds slowed his approach, raising his hands to show he wasn't a threat. "Officer, this is my firefighter. We're responding to an emergency call at this address." Dawson's eyes narrowed. "I got a call about suspicious activity in this neighborhood. Someone breaking into homes." A small crowd of neighbors had gathered now, watching the scene unfold with a mixture of confusion and horror. Some had their phones out recording the incident. "The only emergency here is the house that's about to go up in flames if we don't get back to work," Captain Reynolds said firmly. "This is Jason Taylor, 15-year veteran with Oakland Fire. Now please lower your weapon so we can do our jobs." Dawson didn't move. "I need to see proper identification." Jason's hand closed around his department ID in his pocket. With deliberate slowness, he pulled it out and held it up for the officer to see. "Toss it over," Dawson instructed. Jason did as he was told. the small plastic card landing at Dawson's feet. The officer bent to pick it up, gun still aimed, and glanced at it briefly. "This could be fake," he said, though with less conviction now. By this time, other firefighters had noticed the standoff. The radio on Captain Reynolds' shoulder crackled to life. "Engine 27 to Captain Reynolds, what's the delay?" "Smoke is increasing from the east side of the structure." Reynolds kept his eyes on Dawson as he responded. "We've got a situation here. Police on scene has one of our men at gunpoint." There was a pause before dispatch responded. Tent 4, requesting police supervisor to location. "Officer Dawson," a new voice called. Another police car had arrived and a middle-aged black officer stepped out, taking in the scene quickly. "What's going on here?" "Responding to a call about suspicious persons," Dawson replied, his gun still raised. "Found this one setting up something around the property." The second officer, whose badge identified him as Sergeant Wilson, approached calmly. "I can see the fire truck, Dawson, and the man is in full firefighter gear." "Could be stolen," Dawson insisted, though his voice had lost some of its edge. Sergeant Wilson sighed heavily. "Lower your weapon, officer, now." For a moment, it seemed Dawson might refuse, but slowly he lowered his gun, though he didn't holster it. "Thank you," Jason said quietly. His hands still raised, Sergeant Wilson turned to Jason. "I apologize for my colleague. You can continue your work." But Jason couldn't move yet. The adrenaline that had been pumping through his system wasn't from the fire call anymore, but from the fear that had gripped him when he found himself staring down the barrel of Dawson's gun. "Captain," Luis called urgently from nearby, "the smoke's getting worse." This snapped Jason back to the present emergency. With a final glance at Dawson, who was now being taken aside by Sergeant Wilson, Jason returned to his duties. As he worked, setting up the perimeter with hands that weren't quite steady yet, he could hear snippets of the conversation between the two officers. "What were you thinking?" Wilson was saying. "You pulled a gun on a firefighter at an active scene." "You know what this neighborhood has been like lately," Dawson defended himself. "Break-ins every week. And when I saw him lurking, he's wearing 60 pounds of gear with reflective stripes." Jason tried to tune them out, focusing instead on the job at hand. The fire was spreading faster now, flames visible through a window on the second floor. But even as he moved with renewed purpose toward the engine to gear up for entry, he couldn't shake the feeling of that gun pointed at his chest. Captain Reynolds approached him, concern etched on his weathered face. "You okay to continue, Taylor?" Jason nodded firmly. "Yes, sir. I'm good." "What happened here isn't right," Reynolds said quietly. "We'll address it after we deal with this fire." "Yes, sir," Jason replied, securing his oxygen mask. As he prepared to enter the burning building, Jason caught sight of Dawson still arguing with his sergeant. The officer's face was flushed with either anger or embarrassment, maybe both. What Dawson didn't realize, what none of them knew yet, was that the address they were at had special significance. But that revelation would come later. For now there was a fire to fight and Jason Taylor had a job to do, even with the memory of a gun pointed at his chest still fresh in his mind. The neighbors continued to watch, phones recording, as Jason and his team prepared to enter the burning home, while Officer Dawson stood by his patrol car, his moment of poor judgment now immortalized in dozens of videos that would soon spread across the internet like wildfire. The tension in the air was thicker than the smoke now, billowing from the second floor of the house. Jason tried to focus on the job at hand, but the weight of what had just happened pressed against his chest almost as heavily as his breathing apparatus. Officer Dawson still hadn't holstered his weapon completely, keeping it loosely at his side as if he couldn't quite bring himself to admit his mistake. The growing crowd of neighbors watched the scene unfold with a mixture of confusion and growing outrage. "I need to see everyone's identification," Dawson suddenly announced, taking a step toward the fire truck where the rest of Jason's crew was preparing equipment. Captain Reynolds stepped between Dawson and his crew. "Officer, we don't have time for this. There's an active fire that's growing by the second." "I determine what's a threat here," Dawson insisted, his voice rising. "For all I know, you could be using this fire as a cover for something else." Luis, who had been Jason's partner for nearly 8 years, stepped forward. "Are you serious right now? You think we set a fire as a cover story?" Sergeant Wilson, who had been radioing in the situation to dispatch, approached quickly. "Dawson, that's enough. Stand down." You're not taking this seriously, Dawson argued, gesturing toward the firefighters. This neighborhood has had break-ins all month and suddenly there's a convenient fire and people in uniforms everywhere. Jason exchanged a glance with Captain Reynolds. The fire was growing, and every second they wasted in this confrontation meant more damage to the property and potentially greater risk. Sir, Jason addressed Sergeant Wilson directly, ignoring Dawson. We need to address this fire now. It's spreading to the roof, Wilson nodded. Go ahead. Do your job. He turned to Dawson. And you're going to let them. Dawson's face flushed red. I want all their names and badge numbers when this is done. You'll get them, Wilson agreed, just to end the argument. Now step back and secure the perimeter for the firefighters. Reluctantly, Dawson moved aside, though his eyes never left Jason. There was something in that stare that made Jason's skin crawl, a mixture of suspicion and something deeper, something ugly. With the immediate standoff diffused, Jason and Luis returned to their equipment. More fire trucks had arrived, and the scene was quickly filling with additional firefighters and emergency personnel. You good? Luis asked quietly as they checked each other's gear. Jason nodded, though in truth he wasn't. His hands had a slight tremor that he hoped Luis wouldn't notice. Let's just get this done. As they approached the house with their hose line, Jason caught snippets of conversation from the growing crowd. Did you see that? The cop pulled a gun on the firefighter. I got it all on my phone. That's messed up. The guy was clearly a firefighter. Jason pushed the voices away, focusing on the task at hand. The fire had indeed spread to the roof and they needed to ventilate to prevent a flashover. He and Luis moved toward the front door, prepared to enter the structure. Just as they reached the porch, Dawson appeared again, stepping directly in their path. I need to clear the building first, he announced. There could be suspects inside. Luis stared at him in disbelief. Are you kidding me? There's an active fire. If anyone's inside, they need immediate evacuation, not an interrogation. Step aside, Luis, Captain Reynolds said, approaching quickly. He turned to Dawson. Officer, this is now officially interference with emergency personnel. Either assist by clearing bystanders from the area or return to your vehicle. Dawson's hand drifted toward his weapon again. I'm trying to do my job here. Your job is not to obstruct mine, Reynolds replied, his patience clearly wearing thin. People's lives and property are at risk. Every second you delay us puts everyone in more danger. More police vehicles had arrived, and a senior officer, a lieutenant by the look of his uniform, approached quickly. Taking in the scene, what's the situation here? He asked Sergeant Wilson. Wilson briefly explained, not bothering to hide his frustration. Dawson pulled his weapon on a firefighter and is now preventing the crew from entering the structure. The lieutenant's expression darkened. Dawson, get back to your car now. We'll discuss this later. But sir, now, officer, that's an order. For a moment it seemed Dawson might continue to argue, but something in the lieutenant's tone finally got through to him. With a last glare at Jason, he retreated to his patrol car. I apologize, the lieutenant said to Captain Reynolds. Please carry on with your work. We'll keep the area clear. Reynolds nodded curtly, then turned to his crew. Taylor Rodriguez, you're on interior attack. Thomas and Chen begin ventilation procedures. Let's move. With the path finally clear, Jason and Luis entered the house, the heat hitting them like a wall even through their protective gear. The fire had taken firm hold of the second floor and was spreading rapidly through the ceiling space. First floor clear, Luis called after they'd done a quick sweep of the main level. They moved toward the stairs, staying low beneath the layer of toxic smoke that hung in the air. Jason took the lead, his earlier encounter momentarily pushed aside by the immediate demands of the fire. Second floor, he called, beginning the careful ascent. Outside, the confrontation had not entirely ended. Dawson had retreated to his vehicle as ordered, but he remained there, watching the operation with visible anger. The crowd of neighbors had grown, many with phones recording the scene, and the story of what had happened was spreading rapidly through the gathered onlookers. I heard he pulled a gun on a black firefighter. For no reason, one woman was saying to another. Typical, her companion replied. My son's friend is on the force. Says that guy Dawson has had complaints before. These conversations reached the ears of local news reporter Dana Hunt, who had arrived to cover the fire but quickly sensed a bigger story developing. She approached one of the neighbors who seemed particularly engaged in discussion. Excuse me, I'm with Channel 7 News. Can you tell me what happened here before the fire response? The neighbor, an older man with silver hair, nodded eagerly. That officer over there, he pointed to Dawson's car, pulled his gun on one of the firefighters, a black man who was just setting up safety equipment. I saw the whole thing from my porch. Dana's eyebrows rose. Do you have any footage of the incident? No, but plenty of people do. He gestured to the crowd. Check with that woman in the blue robe. She had her phone out the whole time. Inside the burning house, Jason and Luis had reached the second floor and located the heart of the fire, a bedroom at the back of the house where flames had already eaten through part of the ceiling. We need to hit it hard before it breaks through completely. Luis called over the roar of the fire. Jason nodded, adjusting the nozzle to direct a powerful stream of water at the base of the flames. They worked in perfect synchronization, years of training and shared experience guiding their movements. Through his mask, Jason caught a glimpse of something on the partially burned dresser, a framed photograph. He couldn't make out the details in the smoke and chaos, but something about it tugged at his attention. Luis, cover me, he called, stepping slightly to the side to get a better look. The photo was partially melted, but he could make out a man in a police uniform. Something about the stance, the build. Before he could process what he was seeing, a loud crack from above warned of imminent danger. Ceiling's going, Luis shouted. We need to back out. They retreated quickly, maintaining the water stream as they moved. Just as they reached the hallway, a portion of the ceiling collapsed where they had been standing moments before. All units be advised. We have potential structural compromise, Captain Reynolds' voice came through their radios. Taylor Rodriguez, report status. Second floor becoming unstable, Jason responded. Fire has breached the roof space. We're continuing suppression from a defensive position. Outside, the scene had grown even more chaotic. Additional news crews had arrived, drawn by reports of the confrontation between the police officer and firefighter. Dana Hunt was now interviewing several witnesses, while her cameraman captured footage of the burning house and the emergency response. The police lieutenant approached Dawson's car, his expression stern. I need you to leave the scene, Officer Dawson. Go back to the station and wait for me there. Sir, with all due respect, I was just doing my job, Dawson protested. This neighborhood has been targeted by burglars, and when I saw someone suspicious, a fully uniformed firefighter next to a fire truck with lights flashing was suspicious to you? The lieutenant cut him off. We'll discuss this at the station. For now, your presence here is creating additional problems. Dawson's radio crackled to life before he could respond. All units be advised. We have identification on the property address for the structure fire on Maple Street. The lieutenant grabbed his own radio. This is Lieutenant Parker. Go ahead with that information. There was a brief pause before the dispatcher's voice returned. Sir, the property is registered to Michael and Christine Dawson. Repeat. The burning structure is Officer Dawson's residence. The blood drained from Dawson's face as the words registered. His home. The fire was at his home. Lieutenant Parker stared at Dawson in disbelief. You didn't recognize your own house? I approached from the side street, Dawson stammered, and with the trucks and equipment and people everywhere. I didn't. Inside the house, Jason and Luis had been joined by additional firefighters and were making progress against the flames. The ventilation team had cut holes in strategic locations to release the heat and smoke, giving them a fighting chance to save the structure. Fire's starting to come under control, Luis reported, but there's extensive damage to the second floor and roof. Jason nodded, continuing his work. The encounter with Dawson still lingered in the back of his mind, but the immediate demands of the fire had taken precedence. It wasn't until they finally had the main body of the fire knocked down and were conducting a secondary search that Jason heard the news through bits of radio chatter. Did I hear that right? He asked Luis during a brief pause to change air tanks. This is Dawson's house? Luis nodded grimly. Ironic, isn't it? The guy pulls a gun on you while you're trying to save his own home. The realization hit Jason with unexpected force. He thought of the partially melted photograph he'd seen upstairs. It must have been Dawson in his police uniform. And here they were, risking their lives to save the home of a man who had, just an hour earlier, treated Jason like a criminal. Outside, Dawson stood in shocked silence, watching as firefighters worked to save what they could of his home. The crowd of neighbors, now aware of whose house it was, exchanged meaningful glances and whispered conversations. So he pulled a gun on the man trying to save his own house? one woman said loudly enough for Dawson to hear. Sergeant Wilson approached Dawson, placing a hand on his shoulder. "You should go with Lieutenant Parker, Michael. This isn't helping anyone." For the first time since arriving at the scene, Dawson seemed to deflate, the aggression and suspicion replaced by a dawning horror at what he had done and what was happening to his home. "My wife, she's at her sister's," he said quietly. "She needs to know." "We'll contact her," Wilson assured him. "Go with Parker now." As Dawson was led away to a waiting police car, the firefighters continued their battle against the flames that had consumed a significant portion of his home. The irony of the situation was lost on no one, least of all Jason Taylor, who continued to do his job with the same professionalism and dedication he'd shown for 15 years, even for someone who had seen only the color of his skin, not the badge on his chest or the courage in his actions. The realization hung in the air like the smoke that continued to billow from the partially controlled fire. Officer Dawson stood beside his patrol car, his face ashen as he watched firefighters battle the blaze consuming his own home. The home he hadn't recognized in his haste to confront what he had perceived as a threat. "I need to get in there," Dawson suddenly said, taking a step toward the house. Lieutenant Parker placed a firm hand on his shoulder. "That's not happening, Michael. Let the professionals do their job. But my wife's jewelry, our photos, my service medals." Dawson's voice cracked with emotion. "The same professionals you held at gunpoint are doing everything they can," Parker reminded him, his tone leaving no room for argument. "The best thing you can do now is stay out of their way." Inside the house, Jason and his team had managed to contain the main body of the fire. Though parts of the roof and second floor had suffered significant damage, they were now in the overhaul phase, checking for hidden hotspots that could reignite if left unchecked. "Hey, Taylor," Luis called from across the charred remains of what had been a bedroom. "You hearing what's going on outside?" Jason nodded, using a thermal imaging camera to scan a section of wall. "Yeah, seems Officer Dawson just realized this is his house." "Talk about karma," Luis muttered, pulling apart a section of damaged drywall to expose a smoldering wooden beam. Jason didn't respond immediately. Despite everything that had happened, he took no pleasure in anyone losing their home. He'd seen too many lives devastated by fire to wish that on anyone, even someone who had treated him the way Dawson had. "Let's focus on saving what we can," he said finally. "There's a lot of personal stuff that might still be intact downstairs." They continued working methodically, room by room. In what appeared to be a home office, Jason found a partially damaged display case containing police commendations and medals. The glass front had cracked from the heat, but the contents were largely undamaged. "Captain," Jason called over his radio, "I've found some police service awards that can be salvaged. Permission to remove them from the structure for safekeeping?" "Go ahead, Taylor," Reynolds replied. "We're about ready to wrap up operations anyway. Fire's under control and structure's been fully searched." Jason carefully removed the display case and a few framed photographs that had survived on the walls. One showed Dawson in full dress uniform standing next to an older officer at what appeared to be a graduation or promotion ceremony. Another showed him with a woman Jason assumed was his wife, both smiling on a beach somewhere. It felt strange seeing these glimpses into the life of the man who had pointed a gun at him just hours earlier. The photos humanized Dawson in a way that made the situation even more complex and uncomfortable. Outside, the news crews had multiplied. What had started as routine coverage of a house fire had evolved into something much more newsworthy. The confrontation between a white police officer and a black firefighter, followed by the revelation that the officer had been preventing firefighters from saving his own home, was too compelling a story to ignore. Dana Hunt, the reporter who had first picked up on the developing story, was now conducting live updates from the scene. "We're getting reports that Officer Michael Dawson, the policeman who allegedly drew his weapon on a black firefighter responding to this house fire, was unaware that the burning structure was in fact his own home," she reported, the damaged house visible in the background. Witnesses at the scene described how Dawson delayed firefighting efforts, potentially resulting in more extensive damage to his own property. As Jason emerged from the house carrying the salvaged items, cameras turned in his direction. He kept his head down, focusing on the task at hand rather than the media circus that was developing around him. Lieutenant Parker intercepted him before he could reach Dawson. "I'll take those, Firefighter Taylor," he said quietly. And I want to apologize for my officer's conduct today. Jason handed over the items with a nod. Just doing my job, sir. That's what makes this whole situation even worse, Parker admitted. You were just doing your job, and Dawson? Well, he wasn't doing his, at least not properly. From his position by the police car, Dawson watched the exchange, his expression unreadable. When Jason glanced in his direction, their eyes met briefly before Dawson looked away. Captain Reynolds approached, pulling off his helmet. His face was streaked with soot, but his expression was resolute. Lieutenant, we've done what we can here. The fire's out, but there's significant structural damage to the roof and second floor. First floor has mainly water and smoke damage. Your officer should not enter until a structural engineer has assessed the building. Parker nodded. Understood, Captain. Thank you for your team's work here today. Just doing our job, Reynolds replied with a pointed look at Dawson, despite the complications. Jason rejoined his crew by the engine where they were beginning the process of packing up equipment. The physical exertion of firefighting had temporarily pushed aside the emotional impact of the confrontation, but now that the immediate crisis was over, he felt the weight of it settling back on his shoulders. You saved some of his stuff? Luis asked, nodding toward the items Lieutenant Parker was now showing to Dawson. Seemed like the right thing to do. Jason replied simply. Luis shook his head. You're a better man than me. I might have accidentally dropped it all in a puddle. Before Jason could respond, a commotion near the police line drew their attention. A woman had arrived and was frantically trying to push past the officers maintaining the perimeter. That's my house, she was shouting. Let me through. Dawson's head snapped up at the sound of her voice. Christine. The woman, Dawson's wife, finally broke through and ran toward him. Michael. What happened? Someone called me and said our house was on fire. As she reached him, her eyes widened at the sight of the damaged structure behind him. Oh my God, Dawson pulled her into a tight embrace. I'm sorry, he was saying over and over. I'm so sorry, Christine pulled back, her face confused. What are you sorry for? You didn't cause the fire, did you? Lieutenant Parker stepped in. Mrs. Dawson, why don't we move away from the scene a bit? I can explain what's happened and what the next steps will be. As they moved toward one of the police cars, Jason overheard Christine asking, Why are there news vans everywhere? It's just a house fire, isn't it? Dawson's response was too quiet to hear, but Jason could see the shame in his posture as he walked away with his wife and superior officer. Taylor, Captain Reynolds called. A word? Jason joined his captain a short distance from the rest of the crew. Reynolds had been his commanding officer for most of his career, and they had developed a relationship built on mutual respect and trust. How are you holding up? Reynolds asked, his concern evident. Jason shrugged. I'm fine, Cap, just another day on the job, right? Reynolds wasn't buying it. There's nothing just another day about having a gun pulled on you while you're trying to do your job, especially by the very people who are supposed to be working alongside us to protect the public. What do you want me to say? Jason asked. That I'm angry, scared? That for a moment there I thought I might become another statistic, another black man shot by police for no good reason. If that's how you felt, then yes, that's exactly what I want you to say, Reynolds replied. This isn't something we sweep under the rug, Jason. What happened today was wrong on every level. Jason took a deep breath, looking around at the scene. The damaged house, the news crews, the curious onlookers still recording with their phones. I know it was wrong, but right now I just want to finish up here and go home to my family. Reynolds nodded slowly. Okay, but this isn't over. There will be reports to file, probably an investigation, and I want you to talk to someone about this, the department counselor at minimum. Cap, that's not a suggestion, Taylor. It's an order. Jason knew better than to argue. Yes, sir. As they returned to the engine, they found Sergeant Wilson waiting for them. Captain Reynolds, Firefighter Taylor, I need a moment of your time. Reynolds stepped slightly in front of Jason, his protective instinct kicking in. What can we do for you, Sergeant? First, I want to extend my deepest apologies for Officer Dawson's actions today, Wilson said formally. There is no excuse for what happened, and I assure you it will be addressed appropriately within our department. I appreciate that, Reynolds replied. But I think your apology should be directed primarily to Firefighter Taylor. Wilson turned to Jason. You're right, of course. Mr. Taylor, I am truly sorry for what you experienced today. It was unprofessional, Unwarranted and frankly unacceptable. Jason nodded, accepting the apology but not quite ready to verbalize forgiveness. What happens now? He asked instead. There will be an internal affairs investigation, Wilson explained. Officer Dawson has been placed on administrative leave effective immediately. We'll need statements from both of you as well as any other witnesses. And the media? Reynolds asked, gesturing to the news vans. Wilson sighed. That's going to be a challenge. This story has already spread on social media. Several videos of the confrontation have been uploaded. Our department will issue an official statement, but the damage to public trust, that's going to take longer to address. As they spoke, Luis approached with Jason's water bottle. Thought you might need this, he said, handing it over. Thanks, Jason replied gratefully, suddenly aware of how dehydrated he was after the intensity of the firefighting operation. Lieutenant Parker would like to speak with you when you have a moment, Wilson added. He's the ranking officer on scene and will be handling the initial stages of the investigation. Jason took a long drink from his water bottle, buying himself a moment to think. Part of him wanted nothing more than to leave the scene, to put this whole incident behind him and go home to his wife and children. But he knew that wasn't an option. This had become something bigger than just a personal confrontation. I'll talk to him, Jason agreed finally. Let me just finish helping with the equipment. Wilson nodded. Of course. He'll be by the command vehicle when you're ready. As the sergeant walked away, Luis raised an eyebrow. You okay with all this? Seems like they're suddenly very concerned with your well-being now that the cameras are rolling. Maybe, Jason admitted. But if talking about what happened helps prevent it from happening to someone else, then it's worth it. Across the scene, Jason could see Dawson and his wife in intense conversation with Lieutenant Parker. Christine's body language had changed from concern about the house to something more defensive. Her arms crossed tightly across her chest as she glanced repeatedly toward the firefighters. Looks like he's telling her what really happened, Luis observed, following Jason's gaze. Yeah, Jason said quietly. Can't imagine that's an easy conversation. They watched as Christine suddenly stepped away from her husband, her face a mask of shock and disbelief. She said something to him that made Dawson flinch, then turned and walked rapidly toward her car, ignoring his calls for her to wait. Trouble in paradise, Luis muttered. Jason didn't respond. There was no satisfaction in watching a marriage potentially fracture, even if Dawson's actions had been inexcusable. Captain Reynolds rejoined them. All right, team, let's wrap this up. The structural engineer will be here soon to assess the building, but our work is done for now. As they packed the last of their equipment, Jason noticed Dawson standing alone, watching the activity around his damaged home. The officer's earlier aggression had been replaced by a defeated posture, his shoulders slumped and his eyes hollow. For a brief moment, Jason considered approaching him, saying what? He wasn't sure. But before he could decide, Lieutenant Parker called Dawson over to his vehicle, and the moment passed. Ready to go? Luis asked, closing the last compartment on the engine. Jason took one final look at the scene, the house with its charred roof, the media with their cameras still rolling, the neighbors still whispering among themselves, and Officer Dawson, whose actions had transformed a routine fire call into something that would likely follow all of them for years to come. Yeah, he said finally, I'm ready. As they drove away from Maple Street, Jason gazed out the window, his mind replaying the events of the day. The adrenaline was fading now, leaving behind a complex mix of emotions he couldn't quite sort through yet. What had started as a routine fire call had become something much more significant, a stark reminder of the biases that could turn even the most straightforward situations into potentially deadly confrontations. And yet, in the midst of it all, there was a strange twist of fate. The very man who had seen Jason as a threat had been depending on him to save his home. The irony wasn't lost on Jason. But as they returned to the station, he knew that the story was far from over. The media coverage, the investigation, the inevitable public discourse about race and policing, all of it was just beginning. And somewhere in the midst of it all was a truth that needed to be acknowledged, not just about what had happened today, but about the deeper issues that had made it possible. Jason didn't know what role he would play in that conversation yet, but he knew he couldn't simply walk away from it. Not if he wanted things to change. Not if he wanted to make sure that the next black firefighter or teacher or doctor or ordinary citizen, wouldn't find themselves staring down the barrel of a gun simply for existing in the wrong place at the wrong time. By the next morning, the incident had exploded across social media and news outlets. Jason woke to find his phone flooded with messages from friends, family, and colleagues who had seen the videos or news reports. Even his mother had called from 3 states away, her voice tight with worry despite his assurances that he was physically unharmed. "It's all over the news, Jason," his wife Diane said, showing him her tablet where yet another news channel was discussing the confrontation. "They're calling you a hero for saving the home of the officer who pulled a gun on you." Jason sighed, watching footage of himself emerging from Dawson's house carrying the salvaged items. Someone had captured that moment perfectly, and now it was being replayed alongside the earlier confrontation, creating a narrative of dignity in the face of prejudice that made him uncomfortable in its simplification. "I was just doing my job," he said, the same words he'd repeated to everyone who had asked. "That's why it's so powerful," Diane replied, squeezing his hand. "He wasn't doing his job. You still did yours." Before Jason could respond, his phone rang again. This time it was Captain Reynolds. "Taylor, I know you're scheduled for time off, but we've got a situation developing at the station. The media are camped outside and the chief wants to hold a press conference. He's asking if you'd be willing to attend." Jason closed his eyes briefly. "Do I have a choice?" There was a pause on the line. "Officially, yes. No one can force you to speak publicly about this. But unofficially, this thing is getting bigger by the hour. The department needs to address it, and having you there would send a strong message." "What kind of message?" Jason asked, though he already knew the answer. "Unity. Professionalism. The fact that our firefighters will always do their duty, regardless of circumstances." Jason looked at Diane, who was watching him with concern. She knew him well enough to guess what the call was about. "I'll be there," he said finally. "What time?" 2 o'clock. "And Jason?" "Thank you." After hanging up, Jason explained the situation to Diane. Her expression shifted from concern to resignation. "I knew this wouldn't just go away," she said. "Are you sure you're ready for this? Once you step in front of those cameras, everything changes. Our privacy, your safety." "I know," Jason admitted. "But if I don't speak up, I'm letting others control the narrative. And this isn't just about me anymore." The ride to the station was surreal. Jason had driven this route countless times over his 15-year career, but today it felt different. As he approached, he could see the media presence that Reynolds had mentioned. News vans lined the street, reporters setting up equipment, photographers adjusting lenses. He parked in his usual spot, took a deep breath, and stepped out of his car. Almost immediately, a reporter spotted him. "Firefighter Taylor, can we get a statement about yesterday's incident? How does it feel to know you saved the home of the officer who discriminated against you? Will you be pressing charges against Officer Dawson?" The questions came rapid fire, microphones suddenly thrust toward his face. Jason kept his head down, offering only a quiet, "No comment at this time," as he made his way to the side entrance of the station. Inside, the atmosphere was tense. Colleagues who normally greeted him with casual banter now approached with solemn expressions and supportive pats on the shoulder. Luis was waiting near the chief's office, his face breaking into a relieved smile when he spotted Jason. "Man, I wasn't sure you'd show," he said, embracing Jason briefly. "This circus is something else." "Not really my choice," Jason replied. "Sounds like the chief wants to present a united front." Luis snorted. "United front, right. Like we're the ones who created this problem." Before Jason could respond, the door to the chief's office opened, and Chief Harrison beckoned them inside. The room was already crowded with department officials, the fire commissioner, and a woman Jason recognized as the department's public relations director. "Taylor. Rodriguez, thank you for coming," Chief Harrison said formally. "I know this isn't how either of you plan to spend your day off." Jason nodded but said nothing, taking a seat beside Luis. He could feel the eyes of everyone in the room on him, measuring his reactions, gauging his emotional state. "Here's how this is going to work," the PR director explained, handing out prepared statements. "The chief will open with a general statement about the department's commitment to public safety and cooperation with law enforcement. He'll then briefly outline yesterday's events, emphasizing the professionalism shown by all firefighters involved." She turned specifically to Jason. Firefighter Taylor, we'd like you to speak next. Keep it brief. Focus on the job you were doing, not the confrontation. Emphasize that you were just doing what any firefighter would do. We want to highlight your professionalism, not escalate tensions with the police department. Jason glanced at the prepared statement in his hand. The carefully crafted words felt hollow, sanitized of the reality he had experienced. "And if I don't want to read this?" he asked quietly. The room fell silent. The PR director's smile tightened slightly. "This statement has been approved by the department and the mayor's office. It sends the right message while we navigate a sensitive situation." "The right message," Jason repeated. "But is it the true message?" Chief Harrison leaned forward. "Taylor, I understand yesterday was traumatic. But this press conference isn't just about you or Officer Dawson. It's about maintaining public trust in both departments during a time when tensions are already high. With all due respect." "Chief," Luis interjected, "maybe the public doesn't need more managed statements. Maybe they need to hear what actually happened and how it made Jason feel. That's the reality of what we're dealing with." The PR director looked pained. "That approach could inflame an already volatile situation. And pretending it wasn't a big deal won't," Luis challenged. Jason stared at the statement again, thinking. Finally, he looked up at Chief Harrison. "I'll participate in the press conference, but I need to speak honestly. I won't attack Dawson or the police department, but I won't pretend that what happened was just a minor misunderstanding either." The chief studied him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "Fair enough. But keep it professional, Taylor. That's all I ask." As they prepared to face the media, Jason's phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. "Officer Dawson's wife here. Need to speak with you privately. Important." Attached was a phone number. Jason stared at the message, unsure how to respond or if he should respond at all. Before he could decide, they were being ushered toward the press conference room where the media waited. The room fell silent as they entered, cameras clicking rapidly, video recorders tracking their movements. Chief Harrison stepped to the podium first, delivering his prepared remarks about cooperation, professionalism, and the department's commitment to serving all citizens equally. "Yesterday's incident," he continued, "while unfortunate, does not reflect the generally positive working relationship between our firefighters and police officers. I want to commend firefighter Jason Taylor and his colleagues for their exemplary performance of duty under difficult circumstances." When it was Jason's turn to speak, he approached the podium slowly, setting aside the prepared statement. The room seemed to hold its collective breath, waiting for his words. "My name is Jason Taylor," he began. "I've been a firefighter with this department for 15 years. Yesterday, I responded to a fire call in the Pine Hills neighborhood, just like I've responded to thousands of calls throughout my career." He paused, gathering his thoughts. "What happened next has been captured on video and shared widely, so I won't rehash every detail. Yes, I had a gun pointed at me while I was performing my duties. Yes, that gun was held by a police officer. And yes, the house we were there to save turned out to be that same officer's home." The room remained utterly silent, reporters leaning forward, hanging on every word. "I want to be clear about something," Jason continued. "What happened yesterday wasn't just about me. It's about a pattern that many Black Americans experience every day, being seen as a threat first and a human being second, regardless of what we're wearing, what we're doing, or how we're conducting ourselves." He could sense the PR director's tension from across the room, but he continued, "I didn't save Officer Dawson's home to prove a point or to show that I'm better than him. I did it because that's my job. That's what I swore to do when I became a firefighter, to protect lives and property without question, without hesitation, and without discrimination." Jason took a deep breath before continuing, "I don't know what will happen to Officer Dawson. That's not my decision to make. But I do know that we, all of us, need to look hard at the assumptions we make about each other. Because those assumptions can be dangerous. They can even be deadly." As he stepped away from the podium, the room erupted with questions, but Chief Harrison quickly stepped in, limiting the press to just a few selected queries. Jason stood to the side, feeling strangely lighter having spoken his truth, even as he wondered about the repercussions his words might have. After the press conference ended, Jason checked his phone again, staring at the message from Christine Dawson. After a moment's hesitation, he texted back, I can meet this afternoon. Name the place. The response came quickly. Coffee shop on Elm Street. The one with the blue awning. 4 p.m., thank you. Luis caught up with him in the hallway. That was something else, man. You said what needed to be said. Jason nodded, still distracted by the unexpected communication from Dawson's wife. I just hope it helps rather than makes things worse. Sometimes things need to get worse before they can get better, Luis replied philosophically. You speaking truth isn't what makes things worse. The problem was already there. At 4 o'clock, Jason found himself sitting in a corner booth at the small coffee shop Christine Dawson had suggested. He'd chosen a spot away from the windows, hoping to avoid being recognized after his televised appearance earlier. He recognized her immediately when she walked in, the same woman he'd seen at the fire scene, though today she looked more composed, if visibly stressed. She scanned the room, spotted him, and walked directly to his table. Thank you for meeting me, she said, sliding into the seat across from him. I wasn't sure you would. I almost didn't, Jason admitted. But I was curious. Christine nodded, her hands fidgeting with a paper napkin. I saw your press conference. What you said. It was fair. More than fair, considering. Jason waited, sensing she had more to say. I want you to know that the man you saw yesterday, the one who pointed a gun at you, that's not the Michael I married. At least I didn't think it was. She looked down at her hands. We've been together 12 years. I've never seen him act that way. Mrs. Dawson, to Christine, please. Christine, Jason corrected himself. I appreciate you saying that, but I have to wonder why you're telling me this. She met his gaze directly. Because I need you to understand that this isn't just about a moment of poor judgment. There's more to the story. She explained that Dawson had been dealing with increasing pressure at work. His precinct had been understaffed for months, forcing officers to work double shifts. The Pine Hills neighborhood had indeed experienced a series of break-ins, and Dawson had been criticized by residents for not doing enough to prevent them. The night before the fire, we had an argument, Christine continued. Michael said something about how the suspects were probably young black men from the east side. I called him out on making assumptions without evidence. We went to bed angry, and I left early the next morning to stay with my sister for a few days. Jason listened without interrupting, though he wasn't sure where this was leading or why she felt compelled to share these details with him. I'm not making excuses for what he did, Christine insisted. It was wrong, period. But I think what happened wasn't just about you. It was about his own biases that he wasn't even fully aware of until they were exposed in the worst possible way. What are you asking of me, Christine? Jason finally asked. She took a deep breath. Michael is being investigated. He'll almost certainly lose his job and he might face criminal charges. But more than that, he's lost his way. What he did goes against everything he claimed to believe in. And you think I can help with that somehow? I think you're the only one who can, she said simply. Not for his career, that's probably over. But for his humanity. For him to truly understand what he did and why it was so wrong. Jason sat back, stunned by the request implicit in her words. You want me to what? Forgive him? Talk to him? I want you to consider meeting with him, Christine clarified. Not now, not when everything is still so raw. But eventually, when you're ready, there's a community mediation program that works with cases like this. Jason's first instinct was to refuse outright. He had spoken his piece at the press conference. He had done his job despite being threatened. Why should he now take on the additional burden of helping Dawson process his own biases? And yet something about Christine's sincere request gave him pause. Not because he owed Dawson anything, but because perhaps there was value in such a conversation. Not just for Dawson, but for the larger issues at play. I can't promise anything, he said finally. But I'll think about it. Relief washed over Christine's face. That's all I'm asking. Thank you. As they parted ways, Jason found himself wrestling with conflicting emotions. Part of him still felt the anger and fear from having a gun pointed at his chest. Another part recognized the potential good that might come from confronting this situation head-on. Not just through press conferences and social media, but through direct, honest conversation. The media coverage continued in the days that followed. Jason's words at the press conference were replayed on national news programs, sparking discussions about racial bias, community relations, and the dynamics between different emergency services. Dawson had been officially suspended pending investigation, and the police department had issued a formal apology to Jason and the fire department. But beneath the official statements and procedural responses, there remained the human story, one that couldn't be fully addressed through institutional channels alone. As Jason returned to work the following week, he found himself changed by the experience in ways he was still coming to understand. The weight of unwanted attention followed him, but so did a new sense of purpose. "You know they're calling you a symbol now," Louise told him during their shift. "The firefighter who saved the racist cop's house." Jason shook his head. "I'm not interested in being a symbol. I just want to do my job." "Sometimes we don't get to choose," Louise replied. "Sometimes the moment chooses us." The truth of those words settled over Jason as their engine responded to another call. He hadn't chosen to have a gun pointed at him that day. He hadn't chosen to become the focal point of a national conversation about race and bias. But here he was, and the question now was what he would do with this unexpected platform, not just for himself, but for all those who had experienced similar moments without cameras present, to document their truth. 3 weeks had passed since the incident, but for Jason Taylor it felt both like yesterday and a lifetime ago. The media frenzy had gradually subsided, though he still occasionally spotted his face on the news or social media when the story resurfaced in discussions about racial bias or community relations. The fire department had been supportive, offering him additional time off if needed, and access to counseling services. Jason had accepted the latter, finding that talking through the experience helped him process the complex emotions that continued to surface at unexpected moments. The surge of adrenaline when he saw a police car in his rearview mirror, the heightened awareness whenever he responded to calls in affluent neighborhoods, the way he sometimes found himself hesitating before fully engaging at fire scenes. "It's normal to experience these reactions," the department counselor had assured him. "What you went through was a traumatic event, regardless of how well you handled it in the moment." At home, Diane had been his rock, creating space for him to talk when he needed to, and distracting him with family activities when the weight of public attention became too heavy. Their children, at 10 and 8, understood only that something bad had happened at work, and that their dad was now sometimes on TV. "Daddy," Tommy at school said, "you're famous now," his daughter had told him one evening. "Are you famous?" Jason had pulled her onto his lap, choosing his words carefully. "Not famous, sweetheart. Just someone who people are talking about right now because of something that happened at work." "Was it because you saved that man's house even though he was mean to you?" Even from children, the situation was distilled to its essence. "Something like that," he'd replied. Now, as Jason sat in the small meeting room at the Community Mediation Center, he wondered if he had made the right decision in agreeing to this meeting. Christine Dawson had reached out again after 2 weeks, asking if he had considered her request. After discussing it with Diane, his captain, and his counselor, Jason had finally agreed, not for Dawson's sake, but because he believed that real change sometimes required difficult conversations. The door opened, and a woman in her 50s entered. "Mr. Taylor, I'm Dr. Patricia Walsh, the mediator for today's session. Thank you for agreeing to participate." Jason nodded, shaking her offered hand. "I'm still not entirely sure why I'm here." Dr. Walsh smiled understandingly. "That's perfectly fine. Mediation isn't about forcing resolutions or forgiveness. It's about creating space for honest communication and understanding, whatever that looks like for the people involved." She explained that she would first meet with Jason alone, then with Officer Dawson alone, before bringing them together if both parties felt comfortable proceeding. "At any point, if you decide this isn't helpful or you don't wish to continue, that's completely your right," she assured him. "You're in control of your participation here." They spoke for about 30 minutes, with Dr. Walsh asking Jason to share his experience of the incident and the aftermath, listening attentively without judgment or commentary. "And how do you feel about meeting with Officer Dawson today?" she asked finally. Jason considered the question carefully. "Honestly, part of me doesn't see the point. What happened that day is clear. Everyone saw it. What's there to mediate?" "That's a fair question," Dr. Walsh acknowledged. "Mediation isn't about disputing the facts or minimizing harm. It's about human connection beyond the incident itself, understanding the impact of actions and potentially finding a path forward that has meaning for both parties. And if there isn't one, then that's valuable information too," she replied simply. Not every harm can or should be resolved with neat closure. Sometimes the honest outcome is acknowledging that some bridges remain broken. Something about her straightforward approach reassured Jason. This wasn't about pressure to forgive or to perform reconciliation for others' comfort. It was simply an opportunity to speak his truth directly to the person who had caused him harm. I'm willing to proceed, he decided. Dr. Walsh nodded. I'll speak with Officer Dawson now. It will be about 30 minutes. Left alone, Jason checked his phone, finding a text from Diane. Whatever happens, I'm proud of you. Love you. Her support steadied him as he waited, mentally preparing for a conversation he never expected to have when he responded to that fire call 3 weeks ago. When Dr. Walsh returned, she was accompanied by Michael Dawson. The officer looked markedly different from the aggressive figure who had pointed a gun at Jason's chest. His posture was hunched, his face drawn with stress and lack of sleep. He wore civilian clothes, jeans, and a button-down shirt, a visual reminder of his suspended status. Officer Dawson has also agreed to proceed, Dr. Walsh explained, gesturing for Dawson to take a seat across from Jason. I'll facilitate our conversation, but this space belongs to both of you. An uncomfortable silence filled the room after they were seated. Dawson's eyes flicked toward Jason before dropping to the table. Perhaps we could begin, Dr. Walsh suggested gently, with Officer Dawson sharing what brought him here today. Dawson cleared his throat, his discomfort palpable. First, I want to say thank you for agreeing to this meeting, Mr. Taylor. I know you had no obligation to come. Jason nodded but remained silent, waiting. What I did that day was inexcusable, Dawson continued, his voice unsteady. I've replayed it in my mind 1,000 times, trying to understand how I could have gotten it so wrong. There's no justification for pulling my weapon on you. None. He paused, seeming to struggle with his next words. I've spent my career believing I was one of the good ones, that I treated everyone fairly, that I didn't have those biases. But when I saw you that day, something happened that I'm still trying to understand. I made a split-second judgment based on nothing but the color of your skin. Jason felt a complex mix of emotions listening to Dawson's words, anger still simmering beneath the surface, but also a strange appreciation for the man's willingness to name what had happened without euphemisms or excuses. The hardest part, Dawson admitted, has been facing that truth about myself, that despite what I wanted to believe, I acted on a prejudice that could have gotten you killed. And then to learn that you and your team went on to save my home anyway? His voice broke. The shame of that is almost unbearable. Dr. Walsh turned to Jason. Would you like to respond, or would you prefer to share your own thoughts first? Jason leaned forward slightly. I appreciate your honesty, Officer Dawson, but I have to ask, what do you want from this conversation? Because if you're looking for forgiveness or absolution, I'm not sure that's something I can or should give. Dawson shook his head quickly. No, that's not why I'm here. I don't expect forgiveness. I'm here because I need to face you man to man and acknowledge what I did. And because I believe that confronting this directly is the only way forward. Not just for me, but maybe for others like me, who don't recognize their biases until it's almost too late. Jason considered this. What's happened since that day? With your job, with your life? I'm still on administrative leave while the investigation continues, Dawson explained. But I've already been informed that termination is likely. There's also the possibility of criminal charges for assault and interfering with emergency personnel. He ran a hand through his hair. Christine and I are working through things. She was ready to leave me that day. Said she didn't recognize the man she saw in those videos. Can't blame her. And the house? Jason asked, somewhat surprised by his own curiosity. Insurance is covering most of the damage, but it'll be months before it's habitable again. We're staying with Christine's sister for now. Dawson paused. I heard you were the one who saved my service medals and some of our photos. Jason nodded. Just doing my job. That's what everyone keeps saying about you. Just doing his job. But we both know it was more than that. After what I did, most people wouldn't have gone out of their way to save anything of mine. Dr. Walsh interjected gently. Jason, would you be willing to share how the incident has affected you? Jason took a deep breath.
Physically, I'm fine.
But the experience stays with you. When someone points a gun at you, especially someone who's supposed to protect the community, it changes how you see the world. He described the hypervigilance he sometimes felt, the moments of anger that would surface unexpectedly, the burden of suddenly becoming a public figure in a conversation about race and policing that had been ongoing long before this incident. The hardest part for me, Jason continued, isn't what happened that day. It's knowing that if there hadn't been witnesses, if there hadn't been cameras, if my captain hadn't been there, the outcome could have been very different. And then people would have heard your version of events, not mine. Dawson flinched visibly at these words, but didn't interrupt. And even harder than that, Jason added, is knowing that this happens to people who don't have the protection of a uniform, who don't have witnesses or cameras every single day. People who look like me get pulled over, stopped on the street, questioned in their own neighborhoods, and they face the same fear I felt, but without the same outcome. The room fell silent for a moment as his words settled in the space between them. You're right, Dawson finally said, and that's something I never truly understood until now. I've sat through dozens of diversity trainings and implicit bias workshops, but none of it really sank in. It was all theoretical, something that happened elsewhere, done by other officers. He met Jason's eyes directly for the first time. It took nearly killing an innocent man, a firefighter doing his job, for me to finally see what was inside me all along. Dr. Walsh allowed the moment to breathe before asking, Where do you both see a path forward from here, if there is one? Jason thought carefully before responding. I didn't come here expecting a resolution or a feel-good ending. Real change doesn't happen in a single conversation, but I do think there's value in this, in naming what happened honestly and sitting with the discomfort of it. He looked directly at Dawson. You asked what I want. I want what happened to matter beyond just this incident. I want it to lead to real change in how police officers are trained, in how departments address bias, in how communities hold their public servants accountable. Dawson nodded slowly. I've been thinking about that too. Since this happened, I've been speaking with community leaders about sharing my experience, not to rehabilitate my image, but as a cautionary tale. A first-person account of how bias operates and the damage it can cause. And how has that been received? Jason asked. Mixed, Dawson admitted. Some people think I'm just trying to save my career. Others see value in hearing from someone who crossed a line and now recognizes it. I don't know if it will make a difference, but it feels like the least I can do. As the session continued, they discussed practical steps, a joint statement they might release about their meeting, community forums where both might speak, changes they'd like to see in training for both police and fire departments. There were no dramatic moments of forgiveness or reconciliation, no tearful embraces or promises of friendship. Instead, there was something more authentic. Two men acknowledging a painful reality and committing, in their own ways, to addressing the larger issues it represented. Our time is nearly up, Dr. Walsh noted eventually. Is there anything either of you would like to say in closing? Dawson hesitated, then spoke. Mr. Taylor, Jason, I want you to know that whatever happens with my job or the potential charges, I accept full responsibility for my actions that day. And I'm committed to making sure that something meaningful comes from this, even if that just means being honest about my own failings. Jason nodded, appreciating the straightforwardness. I believe you. And while I can't say I forgive what happened, I do recognize the courage it takes to face this directly. He extended his hand across the table, not as a gesture of absolution, but as an acknowledgement of their shared humanity in this difficult moment. Dawson took it, the handshake brief but significant. Outside the mediation center, reporters had somehow gotten wind of the meeting. As Jason emerged, camera lights flashed and questions were shouted. Firefighter Taylor, did you forgive Officer Dawson? Is this the end of the matter for you? Will you be pressing charges? Jason paused, considering how to respond. The story they wanted was simple, either bitter enmity or heartwarming reconciliation, either ongoing conflict or neat resolution. But the reality, as always, was more complex. Today, Officer Dawson and I had a difficult but necessary conversation, he said finally. Not to close a chapter, but to make sure that what happened between us becomes part of a larger dialogue about bias and accountability in our community. He declined further questions, making his way to his car where Diane waited. As they drove away, she squeezed his hand supportively. Do you think it made a difference? She asked. Jason watched the city pass by outside the window, The neighborhood where he'd faced down Dawson's gun, the streets he'd protected as a firefighter for 15 years, the community that was now watching how this story would unfold. "I think it's a start," he said finally. "Not an ending, but a beginning." The truth was, what had happened that day when a white officer pointed his gun at a black firefighter wasn't just about two individuals. It was about systems and biases that had existed long before that moment and would continue long after the media lost interest in their particular story. Real change would require more than one conversation, more than one incident caught on camera, more than one officer confronting his biases or one firefighter speaking his truth. It would require sustained effort and uncomfortable honesty from communities, institutions, and individuals. But as Jason drove home with his wife, he felt a quiet resolve strengthening within him. Whatever came next, whether speaking at community forums, advocating for policy changes, or simply returning to the job he loved with a new perspective, he would face it with the same courage and integrity he'd shown throughout this unexpected journey. The path forward wouldn't be simple or straightforward. There would be setbacks and resistance, moments of progress and moments of frustration. But in that small meeting room, two men had chosen to confront a difficult truth together rather than apart. And perhaps that was how real change began, not with grand gestures or quick fixes, but with the willingness to engage honestly with the hardest conversations. As they pulled into their driveway, Jason noticed their neighbor, Mrs. Wilson, waving from across the street. She had baked them a casserole the day after the incident, one of many gestures of support they'd received from friends and strangers alike. "You know," Diane said as they waved back, "for all the ugliness this brought to the surface, it's also shown how many good people there are out there, people who recognize what's right and stand by it." Jason nodded, thinking of his colleagues who had stood with him that day, the community members who had shared their own stories after seeing his, the chief who had allowed him to speak his truth rather than recite a sanitized statement. "That's worth remembering too," he agreed. And as they walked together toward their home, Jason carried